this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Friday. Kick off the Winter Olympics in style with the opening ceremony from Italy, featuring a special performance by Mariah Carey. Celebrate the greatest athletes from around the globe as they come together to go for gold.
Lindsey Vonn, sensational!
The opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics.
Ilya Malinin. Redefining the sport.
Friday at 8 Eastern, 7 Central on NBC and Peacock.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Moore. It's hard to try to kind of understand how people define the word trust any longer. It seems as though that ever since I was a child that there has been this kind of evolution in what the word trust actually means. When I was little, if you were doing something you should not have been doing, there was this perception that you could trust others, even outside of your family, to essentially tell your parents what you'd been doing. And that went both ways for other people's kids as well. But trust has kind of taken on a different meaning. I think it comes down to this idea of protection. And when we turn over, if you will, our precious young children to those in authority, and they violate trust, there's something very, very dark about that. Today, we're going to talk about that darkness, and we're going to talk about the impact that trust placed with the wrong folks had on a young lady by the name of Sandra Birchmore. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Dave, I've often said that, as an investigator, if you work cases where you kind of get numb to it relative to, you have two adults that get into a fight and they wind up maybe killing the other one. Back in the 80s, I remember it seemed like night after night I would go on so-called drive-by shooting homicides, rival gangs that were going after one another. They're involved in this street life and that sort of thing. And there's an inherent risk with that. There's an inherent danger with it. But Dave, when it comes to kids, there's something about it that you can never really get numb to. It's like a fresh wound that opens up every time for an investigator. And in this particular case, we're talking about a young woman who she died as a young woman, but this story actually begins a decade earlier where she was involved in an Explorer program.
I don't know if everybody knows what the Explorer program is. It's an extension of Boy Scouts. It's where it began. But it is more in tune with learning about a profession. I'll give you an example. When I was a young person, there was an Explorer post that dealt with radio and television broadcasting. And there were professionals volunteered their time, and it was once a week at night, and you had a couple of hours to go down to the TV station, radio station, and you would take part in a class pretty much and learn real-world applications. They also have one for the police and fire and things like that. And in this particular case, Sandra Birchmore, at 12 years old, which is about the earliest age you can actually be part of an Explorer post. In some, it's 14. But at this particular post, it was 12. At 12 years old, she joined the Explorer post in Stoughton, Massachusetts, which was the police department. The Stoughton Police Department had an Explorer post, and these individuals, young people, were able to learn about police work, investigations, more than just being a street cop, but learning all the different aspects of law enforcement firsthand as a young person. And these posts usually have an age group beginning and ending. It's from 12 to 18 or 14 to 21. Yeah. And in this particular case, Sandra Birchmore was a part of this police Explorer post starting at age 12 through 18, 6 years. And think about the difference in ages of a person when you're 12 years old versus 18.
Holy smokes. Yeah, I've had teenagers in my house.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
And I begin to think about my daughter, my son, and this is kind of obvious, but, just the kind of the trajectory of the changes that they go through during that period of time. That 18-year-old would not recognize that 12-year-old on any level. You don't recognize them as a parent. And so, and I think that one of the kind of dicey areas here is that when you have a very young, impressionable child that enters into this kind of, I don't know, it's very weighty. You're talking about a police department. There's all kinds of stuff there. Yeah. And they go into this environment, and like it or not, both fire and police, it's got a real, when you're around people, it's a very familial kind of thing, because you refer to each other as brothers. And so when you get kind of adopted into that little tribe, if you're going through, say, tough times in your life, that's someplace that someone would feel safe and would flee to. And once you flee to that kind of environment like that, any kind of protections that you might have begin to kind of fall. And boy, it is just ripe for the taking when you think about if there's a predator around.
And that's what happened. Thing is, there was more than one. Now, you're dealing with police officers that are in their 20s and 30s. In this particular case, we're going to talk about one specific police officer named Matthew Farwell. His brother was also involved in a few others. But Matthew Farwell was a part of the Explorer Post as one of the volunteers, as a leader there. He also was on the police force in Stoughton. He was a detective. Well, we mentioned Sandra Birchmore started at the post when she was 12 years old and remained until she was 18. Well, what we didn't tell you is how close she got with certain members of the post. And I think you just talked about that with the familial connection. But you're talking about a 12-year-old girl. And by the way, a diminutive person. She was small. She was 4 foot 10 inches tall.
Yeah.
This is not.
Wait, that's in adulthood.
Yes.
So she would have been even more diminutive. I mean, you think of, and look, I know some people will take offense to this. I don't care. It's the idea that, back then, if you think she's diminutive as an adult, she would appear rather fragile. She'd probably be mistaken for somebody much younger, as a matter of fact, Dave.
Yep. And she was. And Matthew Farwell is 6'4". She's 4'10". He's 6'4". He's a big man.
Yeah.
And they develop a relationship. And some would call it, I would call it grooming. That Matthew Farwell began grooming Sandra Birchmore. And somewhere in her third year of being involved with the Explorer Post, the grooming ended and the activity began. That's what is alleged, because Sandra Birchmore is the reason we're talking about this is this young woman who began her experience with police at the Explorer Post at 12 years old, at 23 years old and 3 months pregnant, committed suicide. The same week, she was researching photographers to take infant baby pictures when they're first born and getting a scheduled time so she could have that done. And then she committed suicide, supposedly. It was ruled a suicide at first. But Joe, the reason we're doing this show today is because it was ruled a suicide.
Yeah.
At first. But then it changed.
Right.
How do we go from something that is a cut and dry suicide to anything else?
Hard to kind of take the measure of it, Dave. And it took a while. This investigation, like you had stated, started in 2021. And it was when she was found in her apartment. And my understanding is that when she was found in her apartment, she had been down for maybe 3 days by the time they had found her. And just let me speak just for a moment about suicide and kind of from the medical examiner's perspective, how we view these. First off, I will just be very, very honest with our friends here. Even though it is a death investigation, once a local police department, and in this case, we have to make clear, Dave, that her death did not occur in the town in which she was involved in the Explorer post. Her death actually occurred in Canton, Massachusetts. And we all know that name because we can't seem to get past it, because in recent months, all we've heard about is the Karen Reed case. So you're talking about a death that occurred there in that jurisdiction where she had her home. But in general, in very broad strokes, when you're talking about a suicide investigation, once the police get the indication, many times, and I've had this happen actually at scenes, Dave, over and over again, once you make the statement as an ME investigator or coroner that, yeah, this looks like it's consistent with a suicide, guess what happens with the detectives many times? They'll say, okay, well, yeah, we'll leave you with this and we'll go ahead and go about our business. Because from a prosecutorial standpoint, there's nothing for them to do at that point in time. You're not going to put the cuffs on anybody. You're not seeking some mysterious person that's out there. And so their interest drops off precipitously. And many times the full weight of this falls onto the shoulders of the ME or the coroner to conduct the investigation. And one of the elements that, and I'm glad you mentioned this about let's see, I think there was like a stroller, the image that she had from ultrasound was actually sitting out on the bar in the actual kitchen. She's talking about purchasing clothing and doing all these sorts of things, for the baby, because she's very excited about it. One of the things that we do with suicide is we try to find an element of intent relative to the individual that has taken their life, obviously. And, well, how do you do that? Well, for us, one of the things we do, first off, we want to find out if an individual is suffering from any kind of psychopathology at all. Are they currently under the care of a psychologist or a psychiatrist? Are they on any kind of medications that would lend itself? Are they being treated for anxiety, depression? Also, has there ever been a previous attempt at taking their own life? Is there any evidence of that on the body? Because many times I've had people, Dave, that and this is kind of the classic thing that you look for. You look at the wrist to see if there's old scars that are consistent with healed, cut marks on their arm that might be kind of superficial. They tried once, it didn't work. Have they vocalized? Here's kind of the terminology that the psychology types like to use. They will say, did the person have suicidal ideation, which means were they thinking about it? The next step is, was there vocalization with it? And so what that means is they're thinking about it and they're actually saying it to somebody. So we go to a great lengths as medical legal investigators to try to understand this. What's their medical history? Is there anything that we need to do to explore to try to find that kernel of intent? And I got to tell you, Dave, in this particular case, I don't think anything like that existed.
Friday. Kick off the Winter Olympics in style with the opening ceremony from Italy, featuring a special performance by Mariah Carey. Celebrate the greatest athletes from around the globe as they come together to go for gold.
Lindsey Vonn, sensational!
The opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics.
Ilya Malinin.
Redefining the sport.
Friday at 8 Eastern, 7 Central on NBC and Peacock.
Dave, I know I've said this to you before, but it bears repeating. our working supposition as medical legal death investigators, and it should be with homicide detectives too, but it is that every death, not some deaths, but every death, and I'm talking about even people that have obvious natural disease, every death we work is a homicide until we can prove otherwise. And what I mean by that is that until I can scientifically verify, whether it's per physical examination or history that I'm getting from family members, or maybe a more extensive examination that is conducted at the morgue, I'm going to assume everybody dies at the hand of another, because here's the thing: those cases, homicide cases, are so highly complex that once you cross that threshold into that dwelling, you cannot step across that threshold again for the first time. All right. You can't repeat that. So you have to make sure that you've covered all of your bases upon that initial contact at the scene to make sure you haven't missed anything. And Dave, when she was found, it kind of seemed like it was probably going to be a suicide at that point in time.
Now, you mentioned that where Sandra Birchmore lived was not in the town where she had been a part of the police force through their Explorer program. That was in Stoughton, but she lived in a place called Canton. So the people on the police force that knew her from being in the Explorer post, they wouldn't have been involved in the investigation into a suicide, would they?
No, they wouldn't. No, and unless some kind of information came up in the course of the investigation that said, well, I'll put it to you this way. You walk into a scene where you will find some kind of collateral information at that scene that says, she's received some kind of award from this other police department. Trust me, that's going to catch the eyes of an investigator that's there. And maybe she's got, maybe she's got T-shirts. Maybe they hand out Explorer badges. Maybe, maybe she's got things in her possession that would give you an indication that she is really interested in law enforcement. Now, you might make a phone call at that point in time, say, hey, look, we're here at a scene. We've got this young lady that's deceased, and is she one of yours? I mean, because she's got all of this stuff from your jurisdiction, they might, probe that at that moment in time. That's really what you would be looking for.
And that makes sense. I mean, you find somebody hanging in a closet or on a doorknob, you would think you've got to find out. When Robin Williams, the comedian, committed suicide using his belt and the door of his closet doorknob, there was a lot of breaking down of how is that possible, what happened, and he's a celebrity who had had issues.
Yeah, he did. He had physical. Can I say something real quick about that? That report that those investigators did, I cannot for the life of me remember the name of that county. It's in the adjacent greater San Francisco area. Is it Marin County? I can't remember. But that arguably, Dave, that might be one of the finest medical legal death investigator reports I've ever read in my life. It was thorough beyond anything you can imagine. So to that point, and he did facilitate his own hanging, from a doorknob essentially, and using a belt in order to do that. And it sounds as though that even though they have not released all of the information in this particular case, it sounds as though that might be what they observed when they arrived at the scene, Dave.
And it is in Marin County, by the way. I looked that up while you were talking, because when you come upon a scene like this and you are going to start trying to find out who the person is, because you said that it was a couple of days between the time that she actually died and the time her body was found.
Yes.
So she would have already gone through the processes that you explained in one of our shows last week, where we went through,
you're right.
The
postmortem changes. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what would her body be like after 2 or 3 days hanging like that?
Well, first off, her limbs are going to be flaccid by that moment in time. And one of the ways they could determine she had been down, and I'm just talking about I'm not talking about when was the last time she was spoken to. I'm just talking about what does the body tell us. All right. So if they're saying 2 to 3 days downrange, first off, there's a high probability that rigor mortis would either be completely dissipated or easily broken. Okay, so the rigidity in her arms after that period of time would no longer be there. I mean, literally, Dave, you could pick her arm up at the elbow and you could easily flex it at that point in time. You could open her jaw, to inspect the mouth and that sort of thing. Whereas if it had happened, like if they had found her within that 24-hour time frame, you'd see the rigidity, but slowly it fades away. And here's one of the things. So if you look at her from this perspective, with the absence of rigidity possibly, and then the settling of the blood with the postmortem lividity, and the key is here, what do we do when we have a body that's in a seated position? Well, if you're seated, on your rear end, the blood is going to gravitate to that area. Guess what? It'll be non-blanchable. So if you pressed her skin, that purple discoloration would not disappear. So for us, when we're looking at a body trying to determine how long the body has been down relative to postmortem interval, there's no doubt that you would see that and you would think as an investigator, wow, she's been down a while. And also at that point in time, when you have for that period of time, sometimes you can pick up on a very faint odor. Also, there are these changes that occur after, say, like 72 hours. You'll begin to see the fingertips shrivel, and they'll become like dehydrated to a certain degree, but only the fingertips. You're not going to see it all through the body. And so there are just signs that you can tell that they've been down longer than just, say, a couple of hours. And that's one of the things that, you try to bracket that time, because if you can bracket that time, and we know that they know some stuff about Sandra, that there had been phone calls that were placed where she was trying to schedule these infant photographs.
Right.
This is a young lady that's very excited about this day.
She is.
There was actually a stroller. She had bought a stroller.
Yep.
You remember this, as a dad. I mean, your guts are turning inside out and you're terrified, but there's a bit of excitement to it, and you're purchasing clothes and diapers and all that stuff to get ready. It's one of the finest times of my life. I remember being excited, and as well you should be. You're celebrating a new life that's going to come. And but you marry all of that together, that circumstantial data, and it paints a picture of what was going on at those moments prior to her death. Here's the thing, Dave. Who's going to go to all of this trouble if they're going to end their life? Who's going to do these things? And so for me, as a ME investigator, coroner investigator, I'm sitting there thinking, this doesn't add up. And not to say, and I don't think there's a note, but notes are the exception, not the norm. People think you're going to find a suicide note. I'd say probably 2 out of 10 cases that I worked with suicides, would you find a note or some kind of scribbling? They are, in fact, the exception, not the norm. So that's not a real good placeholder for you from an evidentiary standpoint.
But you mentioned you would try to ascertain what was going on in her life at the time. What was her mental, emotional stability? What is she thinking? And based on what they are seeing, a young woman, very excited about being pregnant and the thought of having her baby. And now she's what appears to be committed suicide. Now, are they going to start looking from an investigative standpoint? They're going to look at all of her personal relationships, obviously, right? That's the first place they're going to start, because we got to find out more about her. What could have turned her, if we believe it's a suicide, what could have turned her mood so dark when it was so sunshine, rainbows, and unicorns to this? And how do you find that out? Are we actually going to be picking up the phone, going through the Rolodex? What are we going to do?
Well, I got to tell you, the first place I always start, I like to talk to the immediate family. But Dave, I got to tell you, not everybody talks to their immediate family. Now, who do you spend the most time with? If you're single and you're working, That's a big clue. Who do you spend the most time with? Well, it's not your mom and dad most of the time. It's not siblings, because, once you become an adult, if you have siblings, you kind of go your separate ways, live your life. It's going to be people you work with. And yes, she might have girlfriends, that she interacts with, some male friends perhaps. But if you are working full time, think about how much time all of us spend at work. Now, they say you can't choose your family, but many times you can't choose the individuals you work with either. They're hired independent of you. But there are the certain relationships at work where you begin to feel confident with the people that you talk with, that you confide information in them, that you're not going to call up a sibling necessarily that you only see a couple of times a year. One of the things I always do is I try to track down where this individual worked and try to find somebody at work that'll have a conversation with me. I'll start with like a supervisor most of the time, because supervisors can tell you a lot. First off, they know if you've been sicking out. They know what your job performance is like. They know what your attitude is like while you're there. Are you angry? Are you easily frustrated? Have you, threatened to do harm to anybody in the office? And then the people that shares the space immediately adjacent to you, they're going to see. The thing about it is, if you work in one of these cubicle type of environments, isn't it amazing the conversations you can hear going on next to you? That's, it's that kind of thing. And you have to begin to kind of indwell that space that these individuals lived, their living space, if you will, and go back and retroactively try to piece together all of this stuff. You do that if they have physicians. I love to call physicians up, and I try to be very gentle when I do this, because people really develop great relationships with physicians. And you drop the bomb on a physician like that and tell them that their patient is dead. You try to be as gentle as you can with them, but you want to try to get information from them. Now, sometimes physicians won't give it up because they're afraid of getting sued. And out of that group, psychiatrists are the worst. You have to issue a subpoena many times, but I have had them. They'll say, sure, I'll tell you everything. I'll give you what she's been diagnosed with or whatever. Wow. But there's no indication of any of this kind of thing here. As a matter of fact, what we're hearing about is kind of a bright and cheery affect, and it's a head scratcher when you're an investigator. So how do you put two and two together, where you've got this young woman that's in her home that has apparently hung herself, but yet she's living this life where she's excited about what the future holds, Dave?
At what point, Joe, do you look at the surroundings and say, this doesn't look right? Was there anything in the surroundings around this supposed suicide that stood out?
Well, first off, she is not what you refer to as let me phrase this so that folks understand. She is not what is referred to as a classic suspension hanging, where you have that hard point where an individual is going to tie off a rope or some type of ligature and then kind of free swing in the air, kind of the classic kind of hanging type of thing. We're talking about a supported hanging. And a lot of people, I think I've had people in classes that have asked me, how in the world can somebody do this? Well, they can do it. I've had people hang themselves on the side of hospital beds in psychiatric wards where they just essentially wrap something around their neck, they tie it off, and they just sit down and they go to sleep, because you're cutting off your carotids at that point in time. And it's more you're depriving the brain of oxygen is what's essentially happening at this point in time. It's not a matter with a hanging like this where it's kind of supported and they just kind of lean into it and sit down. It's not one of these events where there's a violent drop, like in an old Western movie, where they drop through the floor of the gallows and that sort of thing. It's not like that. There's not a level of violence there that comes along with this. This is kind of a slowly kind of sinking down. And I think many people think, how is it that you can resist the urge to take this thing off of your neck? And that's the big question, isn't it? How could she have done this? And also, do these injuries actually marry up with the idea of this being self-inflicted? Or is it something a bit more ominous?
Friday. Kick off the Winter Olympics in style with the opening ceremony from Italy, featuring a special performance by Mariah Carey. Celebrate the greatest athletes from around the globe as they come together to go for gold.
Lindsey Vonn sensational.
The opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics.
Ilya Malinin.
Redefining the sport.
Friday at 8 Eastern, 7 Central on NBC and Peacock.
Dave, I'm not going to say I didn't see this coming because this case has been mentioned to me. Well, actually, it was mentioned to me by some friends that I have in the media, I guess probably a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And I took a look at it at that time. Something just didn't add up with it. And there were suspicions that were floating around. You even mentioned that, Dave. I think that's a good place to start with this, isn't it? There were phone calls that were made
there were rumors,
prior to her being discovered dead, correct?
I mentioned at the very beginning that she was involved in the Explorer post at the police station there in Stoughton. And that's a big part of this story. And she did have a relationship with some of the adult men that were volunteers that were part of that Explorer post from about the age of 15. Now, she was there when she was 12. When she was 15, she starts having a child cannot have a sexual relationship with an adult. They can be raped by an adult. They cannot have sexual relations with an adult.
Right.
So I am misspeaking every time I say that, and I apologize. She was groomed and raped by, allegedly. And
Yes.
when her suicide is being investigated, they start peeling the curtain back to find out more about her, and they find out, oh, wait a minute, she was really involved in that Explorer post, and wait a minute, 2 weeks before her death, the Stoughton Police Department got a phone call from an anonymous person who said that Sandra is pregnant, and that one of the police officers is the father, and that's what began the investigation explosion. And yet, Sandra Birchmore, was 3 months pregnant when she died. Matthew Farwell, who's 38 now, was the man that was accused of impregnating her. And so they start that investigation, and they find out that a number of police officers in the Stoughton in Stoughton Police Department were involved in inappropriate relationships with individuals in the community. And it was a big investigation into the police department. And again, you had this young woman's suicide that started, that really opened the door for the investigation. And that phone call to the police department that says, hey, this guy is putting hands on her. That was the part that really got their attention. I think I mentioned this earlier. As an adult woman of 23, Sandra Birchmore is 4'10",
Yes.
and Matthew Farwell is 6'4". Putting hands on her at that size, that's Shrek. That's a big person compared to her diminutive stature. She's 3 months pregnant, and now they're looking into all of her relationships with all of the men. All of the men now that are involved in that Explorer post are now exposed, and they're digging through the department, Joe, all to find out what really happened. Meanwhile, her family, Sandra Birchmore's family, there's no way that she was excited about being pregnant. There's no way this happened the way you're claiming it did. There's a cover-up going on. So they hired their own pathologist, not just any pathologist. They're filing a lawsuit, so they hired former New York pathologist, a guy who's one of the biggest names in America, Michael Baden. Dr. Michael Baden was hired by the family, Joe.
Yeah. And listen, if you're there's a couple of people out there that if you're seeking to illuminate a situation relative to forensic pathology, I think that probably Dr. Baden is at the top of the heap. And of course, we all know he has famously been involved in the examination of the Jeffrey Epstein case. And I have to tell you, this is not too dissimilar when we begin to think about the mechanism that is involved in this. We're talking about a hanging, Dave. And listen, with Dr. Baden, he's got a lot of miles on the tires relative to how many of these cases he's seen over the years. Because not only did he work as at the OCME, the Office of Chief Medical Examiner in New York, he was also the state medical examiner for the state of New York. He's seen a thing or two during his time. And let me kind of break this down to you. Now, we don't know the specifics at this point in time, but one of the things that you look for, if our friends will just kind of think about a hanging, when you think about a classic hanging, a ligature is placed around the neck, and because of the distribution of weight, the body is literally pulling down on the ligature if it's anchored to like a doorknob, like we've mentioned. As it pulls down, that noose forms like a gigantic teardrop in the air. Okay, just think about it. Okay, where it's you have the apex that's up at like the 12 o'clock position. And as a result of that, the ligature marks themselves will run up behind the ears, okay, because the weight is being pulled down. I'm just wondering if when they conducted this autopsy, first off, I want to know, was the ligature removed from her neck at the scene? That's a problem. We have kind of a standing rule that if you find a body that is suspended, and remember, what did we say about her? That she had been down 2 to 3 days. You have no reason to remove the ligature at that point in time. There's no reason. You go to the anchor point and you cut the anchor point. You don't cut it away from the neck because you want to see the body in this initial configuration at the morgue. Most of the time, a physician is not going to be at the scene. It's going to be an ME investigator, and they will document it photographically, and they'll bring those in, the images. They'll have those images transmitted to the pathologist. They'll be able to see how the body looked there, but there's something about being able to appreciate that ligature / noose around the neck in its pristine form. You don't want to remove it. Now, we've got this idea of the teardrop, right, that's going upward. And this forms something called tinting feature, like a pup tint. Okay. So that when you remove the ligature, you'll see these furrows that run behind the ears that go upward. And it's generally kind of low on the neck and on the anterior side. However, when you're looking at a ligature strangulation, and they have mentioned the term strangulation, we don't know if the strangulation was facilitated by hands or if it was facilitated by a ligature. Those marks, if it is a ligature and it's a ligature strangulation, are going to run parallel to the shoulders, not vertical in orientation, but parallel. So it literally goes back and the furrow looks completely different. I'm wondering if they missed that at autopsy. And the other thing is, if this was a manual strangulation where hands were actually placed on her neck, going back to what Baden had talked about with Epstein, one of the things that his bone of contention with Epstein is that the hyoid was fractured. And hyoid fractures generally only occur with manual strangulation. So how thoroughly did they dissect the neck at autopsy, which is something that you would, as a matter of fact, not only would you dissect the neck, you would preserve the organs of the neck. That means that the larynx comes out, you examine it at autopsy, you save the hyoid, you do not send it to the funeral home with the body. But if they're thinking that this is a suicide, that might be gone. So Dr. Baden might only have photographs to refer to. The other thing you're going to be looking for are when the layer of skin is reflected and you begin to look for the hemorrhages, Dave, in the soft tissue of the neck. If you have like a manual strangulation, those areas of hemorrhage will be very diffuse because it covers a wider area than just that narrow little furrow. was something missed in the soft tissues of the neck relative to that. There's something that is telling Dr. Baden, I would imagine scientifically at least, something there's a proverbial nail he can hang his hat on, his intellectual hat. And because he's sticking his neck out relative to this. He's calling this a homicide. He's not saying, well, he's not wishy-washy. He's saying this is a homicide. And not only is he saying it, the family is taking this as gospel, and they're pursuing a civil action in this case. And that's kind of how all this kicked up. And of course, this is going to draw the eye of the FBI. And
the chief of police, Joe. No, the chief of police. The chief of police in Stoughton. She said, "I'm not a forensic pathologist. I'm not a scientist." But reading Dr. Baden's letter, she's just mortified by what she's reading, that what he said took place. And that's where you were talking about that investigation. Granted, he's a hired hand by the family. They're trying to find out what happened to their daughter, their loved one that they didn't believe committed suicide. And Dr. Baden mentioned, Joe, beyond the physical examination, he mentioned in his paper the investigation that was done by the Stoughton Police Department into the life of this young woman. And, when we were talking about how happy she was about being pregnant and all of those things, that she was doing, trying to line up a photographer, that all came from Stoughton Police Department, from their investigation.
So, so this is my question, I think, from an investigative standpoint. This actually took place in Canton. And I'm just wondering, and this is just me thinking out loud, what level of contact is there between Stoughton and Canton? Because that troubles me. This is another reason this troubles me, Dave. Over the course of my career, I don't just instruct in college. Okay. I'm not just a college professor. I teach at Police Academy, and I also teach investigators. I have sat through and I have administered instruction in the investigation of staged suicides. Well, Dave, that's what really gives this such a dark, sinister turn, is that when you've got a civilian that does and we've covered them before on Body Bags, Dave, a staged suicide. I think we did one very recently. Forgive me, I can't remember which one it was, but we have done it. Dave, if you're a police officer, a detective, an investigator, you're sitting through a class, and these classes can last maybe 1-2 days, 16 hours of instruction, perhaps. What did you learn in that class? Because let me tell you what the FBI is doing now. The FBI will have literally gone back into his training records. Let this sink in just for a second. We'll go into his training records, and they will look at every school he's ever attended, any kind of professional training he's had. And it's something that cops hear about, but it's not necessarily something that everyone is trained in. He's a detective, and it's a small department. My thought is that in a department this small, you're not going to have like an individual homicide division. You're going to have what they refer to as a crimes against persons. So he would handle assaults, battery, homicides, abuse cases, that sort of thing. Anything that's a crime against a person, as opposed to a property crime, which might be a theft or something like that. So they're very broad-ranging, practitioners in this environment. I wonder what kind of training he's had. Has he had any exposure to this whatsoever? The FBI likes him for this. I mean, they have charged him now, and their charges are very interesting, the way they're worded, because, the feds don't have, and even the U.S. Attorney General for that district, when he gave his press conference, he actually alluded to the fact that the feds don't have a homicide charge, and they don't investigate. Homicide is a state charge. They are investigating this case from the perspective of he killed a witness. Think about that just a second. That goes to like the very essence constitutionally when you begin to think about civil rights, as you're depriving somebody of their ability to communicate with the cops if they're going to give testimony against them. So you're going to eliminate somebody, and plus FBI generally investigates when it comes to policing. They will investigate any kind of malfeasance that's going on inside of a department, and that's the other troubling thing. You think they're going to come in to investigate a single cop that's having a sexual relationship that started as a minor? Why didn't it? And that's my question here. Why didn't it just stop with the Massachusetts State Police?
Right.
Why was this kicked up to a federal level? Because anytime you get to that level where you're drawing the eye of, the all-seeing eye. I think about the movie Lord of the Rings, that big eye going. When you draw the attention of the FBI, they're doing other stuff, trust me. But yet this one case that is a suicide draws their attention so that they're vested in the investigation. Dave, I think, in my estimation, this is merely the string that they're going to pull that could perhaps unravel the entire sweater. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.